Right. Welcome everyone to our plenary lecture for this conference, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Michael Roper, who is at the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex. He comes to Britain by way of Melbourne, a wonderful city, and he did his PhD on masculinity and management culture after 1945 in the Department of Sociology. So he's never left Essex, he loves it so much.
That isn't true. Neither part of that.
So what Mike has worked on, he's worked on obviously a number of areas in his career. And you know, we probably all read his books and enjoyed them enormously, I know I do. He works on war memory and the transmission of trauma, war and family relationships in 20th century Britain, and now I think the relationship between psychoanalysis and history. So an absolute trio, just those three things are absolutely fascinating topics. He's written a very important book that I've used quite a lot called The Secret Battle, Emotional Survival in the Great War, and probably his other, I'll just mention a couple of his publications because there's quite a lot. He's written a book that came out, I think, with OUP, Masculinity in the British Organisation, the Organisation Man since 1945. So it's my very great pleasure to present to you Mike Roper, and he's going to be talking about the Long Great War, Psychological Legacies Across the Century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. Emotions are running high among historians and cultural commentators in the UK as the centenary of the First World War approaches. And in this paper, I want to reflect on why this is and explain my approach to studying the war's emotional legacies. I'll argue that the debates about the centenary are not just a matter of disciplinary allegiance, political persuasion, or historical temperament, but are themselves reactions to a psychological aftermath of mourning, violence, loss, suffering, repugnance, disgust, shame, which continues to demand our attention. This aftermath continues to draw later generations back to the First World War, but also creates difficulties for historical understanding. I think historians have by and large failed to appreciate the power and reach of these legacies which animate successive generations as they seek to reach some kind of settlement with the war. The first part of the paper examines some of the current discussions about the centenary and describes their emotional tenor. And I'll go on to describe my research on subjectivity and what I'm calling the generation between, that is about children born between the wars. My aim is to understand more about those who came afterwards and what was transferred to the next generation by men and women who'd gone through the war. Part 2 then is based on my interviews with children of disabled soldiers. I've interviewed 22 people so far, 11 of whom had fathers who received disability pensions. And then the final part deals with child psychology between the wars, and it's concerned with the war's impact on psychoanalysis, and in particular its impact on theories of children's subjectivity as pioneered by Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, among others. I'm just going to talk about these as two kind of case studies, perhaps rather in the way that Peter did, as examples of how the aftermath became part of the fabric of later societies. And I think this kind of history focuses on how the emotional damage of the war was carried psychically as well as culturally. It illuminates a longer history of aftermath and perhaps sheds some light on the emotional flashpoints as we approach the centenary. Okay, so in his address at the Imperial War Museum, and going back to Gary, wasn't it, and the presentation on Gast, that's the same room, I think, as Gast is, but in this case we get David Cameron behind Nash's The Men in Rome, and interesting to ask why it's not Gast in this case. Maybe it's interesting he's there. There he is, though. But in his speech in October 2012, setting out his vision for the centenary, he worked an uneasy emotional mix. He began his address by talking about the scale of loss. Of the 14,000 parishes in England and Wales, he said, only around 50 were thankful parishes where all the soldiers had returned. The sheer scale of the sacrifice, some 16 million dead, had to be marked. And he talked about the 2,400 cemeteries which were constructed in Belgium, France, and also in places as far afield as Brazil, Syria, Egypt and Ireland, which commemorated the dead. And he announced that £5 million would be given to schools in an educational program that would include trips to the battlefields and cemeteries of France and Belgium. And in my hotel room, I have a publication which is all about Flanders, and on page 2 there's an article about all the children who are going to come and visit this area because of the money devoted by David Cameron's government to this exercise. Okay. But he also talked about how his hopes that the commemoration would foster national pride. The sacrifices made by the British people in the war demonstrated their, quote, national spirit. Their sacrifices, he said, had been made for us, and they make us who we are today. His attempt to inject a positive note about national spirit, I think, appeared crass at points, such as when he expressed the hope that the commemoration would generate the same enthusiasm as the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of 2011, which had also, he said, symbolised who we are as a people. Cameron was certainly alive to the war's capacity to compel our attention. He began his speech with a memory of visiting the Imperial War Museum as a child, and he talked about the capacity of Owen and Sassoon and the contemporary novels of Fawkes, Barker and Morpurgo to leave current generations still, quote, absolutely transfixed by what happened in the war. For Cameron, there was no avoiding the emotional potency of the conflict, although all the participants were now dead. Its significance, he concluded, was, quote, not just in our heads, but in our hearts. It has an emotional connection. I feel it very strongly, he said. Now, the welter of reactions to Cameron's speech over the following year illustrates, I think, a split emotional legacy of the First World War in Britain. On the one side are those who decry any attempt to resurrect the war as an example of meaningful sacrifice, and who wish to keep alive a legacy of futility, horror and loss that transcends national boundaries. Paul Fussell, I think, neatly outstepped his critics when he described people like himself as members of the Boohoo Brigade, but that's a tag which has also been affixed to this tendency by military historians and others. And just to give you the quote from Fussell's 2000 edition in the Afterword, where he talks about the image of the soldier on the first edition of the book and why he chose it, and links it into a message, a universal message about the damage of the war, of the 20th war in the 20th century. On the other side are those who wish to unsettle the hegemony of tragedy in the memory of the war, and who wish to admit other emotions into public consciousness, such as pride. And I think of them in a couple of phrases. One that springs to mind is rather an American anachronism. It's the enough already school. You know, we've had too much horror, it's enough already. But also the kind of man up school, which you'll sort of see in the way I talk about it later on. Okay, so that is BBC History's New Thinking on the First World War, a stage of middle-aged men. Mark Connolly, I would take as an exception to that group, but there they all are. If that's New Thinking on the First World War, there it is. So, that was an event in November last year, and before that, Hugh Strawn wrote a provocative article titled "Why We Should Celebrate the First World War as Well as Commemorate It," and he warned against giving into the emotions that the events would inevitably arouse. Moved by the beautifully tended graves on the Somme, Passchendaele, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, he says, quote, "In our emotion, too many of us may repeat those accusatory adjectives thrown so often at the First World War, wasteful and futile." For Strawn, emotion clouds historical judgment. In particular, present generations fail to appreciate the legitimacy of the war as people understood it then. He says, quote, "We pass over too quickly their references to the justness of the cause." The commemorations thus risk becoming anachronistic events in which people honour those who died without understanding the cause for which the participants were willing to give their lives. There's a note of impatience at the perceived hold on the public imagination of horror. And he says that without a better understanding and appreciation of why people fought, quote, "this commemoration is unlikely to deepen our understanding, and so will prove as futile and wasteful as the stock cliches about its appalling losses." Now I have to say I share in part his concern about the kind of reinvestment in the kind of loss and horror narrative. Strawn was relatively temperate in his call for the commemorations to make more of the values for which Britons fought. But in recent months, Max Hastings has upped the ante, condemning David Cameron and his colleagues for what he called their boohoo tendencies. He says the notion of the war as pointless tragedy in which Britain's idiot generals committed mass murder had derived, quote, from watching Blackadder when they were in short trousers. And he's talking about David Cameron. Rather than bowing to political correctness, Cameron and the government should proclaim the war's importance, and by implication Britain's importance to the freedom of Western Europe. Hastings had sniffed out the pacifist leanings in Cameron's comments on remembrance, and he wanted pride instead to take centre stage. A month later, it was reported that the German Special Envoy for the centenary had met his British counterpart, Andrew Murrison, to discuss the British government's response. An official from the consulate was apparently concerned by the, quote, declamatory tone of some pronouncements and had requested that, quote, remembrance and reconciliation should be the dominant emotions in the commemorations. Mourning was something they could all agree on. Quote, what unites us is that we lost millions of people, unquote. So the line being run in the popular press by Hastings and others was clearly having a larger impact. It was in this feverish context that the No Glory group was formed this summer. Composed of anti-war activists drawn from theatre, literature, music and other cultural industries, its explicit aim is to counter the, quote, what I call the enough already or man up tendency. It has a glossy website and a petition which viewers can sign and counts the poets, the poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy, the actors Jude Law and Alan Rickman among its celebrity members. The composer Brian Eno explains the organisation's concern that, quote, war will be presented as something glorious and part of our national heritage when it isn't. It was a total disaster that was unnecessary and destroyed a generation, unquote. He recommended Max Arthur's Forgotten Voices of the Great War, an edited collection of, quote, simple transcripts of soldiers remembering, unquote, which would dissuade anyone from going to war. For the No Glory campaigners, horror must remain the principal legacy of the past conflict and the chief means of emotional persuasion for future generations. Now, these debates replay long-running conflicts between the kind of more literary pacifist and military historical approaches championed by the so-called revisionist historians, among whom I'd also include Brian Bond, Gary Sheffield and others. Gary's up on the stage there. Their respective positions are well observed by the literary biographer Mark Bostridge. Quote, you see them at conferences not talking to each other, glaring at each other. The military historians want to say that the German desire for European hegemony was so worrying that we had to go to war. The British generals weren't so terrible. The literary historians have a perspective that's much more influenced by the war poets, that the whole thing was a disaster. Now, as most of you are cultural historians of the First World War, I'm sure you recognise that military history kind of position. I suspect that the hostility towards literary approaches is partly a case of sour grapes on the part of historians who resent the audiences and fat advances that can be achieved in particular by the novelists. Rivalry surfaced a couple of years ago when the poet Andrew Motion published a poem based on the voices of shell-shock victims. This was, he said, a found poem whose testimony Motion claimed to have orchestrated. The victims' voices, he said, had been largely invisible to history, but in fact, Motion had taken them from Ben Shepherd's wonderful history of war neuroses, A War of Nerves. Motion had, however, bypassed the historical interpretation and lifted out the quotations, as if no historian had yet proved capable of giving voice to the emotional situation of the victims. But I wonder, how else could you describe a book like Peter Barham's Forgotten Lunatics of the Great War, if not as just this kind of exercise in reclamation? Why is it that the poet comes in and says, you know, I can create that direct connection, but somehow the historian's voice doesn't quite have the same cachet when one could describe what we do too as a form of important reclamation? So in that case, I'm also expressing my envy, but anyway. As Bostridge implies above, the military and literary positions are terribly overdetermined, and they risk impoverishing the very historical understanding they claim to want to rehabilitate. While the revisionists might rue the dominance of the horror narrative, their fixation with attacking it further restricts the vision. I'll pick out some of the more damaging consequences. Firstly, the revisionists erect an unhelpful and quite gendered distinction between the historian as dispassionate judge and the literary scholar as somehow succumbing to the emotion. It's almost like they want Epsom salts for this, for the literary scholars to kind of, get them to recover from their swooning. But anyway, Paul Fussell, as I said, is the exemplar of the boohoo approach, and the military historians happily have pinned to him the boohoo label he first affixed to himself. Fussell's work, they say, is full of historical inaccuracies, so it's not really history at all. It's too emotional, too subjective. For these historians, the emotion, or more precisely the horror, has to be evacuated before historical analysis can proceed, but unfortunately it keeps flooding back. In fact, however, Hastings and others don't want to banish emotions from the history of war, but to create a space for different emotions, specifically pride and belief in the value of sacrifice, at a time when Britain is involved in other conflicts whose military value and humanitarian consequences are being hotly debated. The question of who pays the piper might be infelicitous, but it's not irrelevant. The terms of these debates leave a host of other emotions out of the frame, not least aggression and anger. Anglo-American social and cultural historians have, on the whole, been more comfortable investigating pain and victimhood. More than a decade after the publication of Joanna Burke's Intimate History of Killing, which drew attention to the privileging of trauma over aggression in Anglo-American scholarship on the war, her book, doesn't join that many others in what it covers. By contrast, I wonder if it's difficult for German historians to investigate legacies of suffering between the wars because of the way the Second War always casts its backward shadow. Aggression or the political mobilisation of grief and disability, rather than the emotional experiences of victims, dominates German scholarship on the 20s and 30s. So, secondly, I think these debates create a narrow and lopsided understanding of emotion in historical analysis. British culture and society was fundamentally shaped by the emotional fallout from the war in ways I think we have yet to fully comprehend a century later. And I think the Boohoo Brigade are right to emphasise the subjective aspects of these legacies. At the same time, much as a poet like Motion might profess that he's merely orchestrating the feelings of the victims, in the absence of the eyewitnesses, the emotions are now simulacra, created by technologies, aesthetic forms, or plundered from historical texts. Among cultural historians and military historians, by contrast, I think there's been a rather unhelpful conjunction of revisionist and constructivist tendencies, which has impoverished the discipline's ability to tackle psychological questions and has left the field open then to the literary scholars. Among cultural historians, the focus of scholarship over the past couple of decades has been on memory. Such approaches tend to emphasise the afterwardness of memory, its post hoc aspect, rather than what I would call instead the aftermath. In a collection on the legacy of the Great War, published around the 90th anniversary, historians as diverse as Len Smith, John Horn, and Jay Winter were agreed on the rupture between emotional experiences in the war and the post-war narrativization and narratives of victimization and horror. The emotional range of testimony at the time of the war, warns Horn, was different from that which followed. And putting it in more stark terms, Len Smith insisted that the victim narrative did not start with the war, but was a post-war construction. These approaches concur in emphasising the difference between emotions in war and emotions in memory. And in his study, Dan Todman takes a similar epistemological stance. Memory is created not from the participant's experience of war, but from the social and political circumstances that follow, and the literary endeavours of a small group of junior officers in the late 20s and 30s, which were taken up in the 1960s in the context of anti-war movements, the BBC TV programme The Great War, the Memoirs of Old Soldiers, and although Todman doesn't mention it, I'd add actually the rise of social history, which I think is fundamental to the witnessing, the sort of narrative of the Trench soldier, which became, says Todman from the 60s, quote, the icon of experience. So horror takes centre stage, becoming in the 1960s the essential truth of the war. Now, I don't want to privilege Todman, but I find the book very annoying and insightful. At points he's suggestive about an alternative interpretation of memory, which is carried by the participants through families and across generations. The horror myth emerges, he says, in part from the testimony of survivors in old age. And he makes the interesting point that their sons and daughters, among whom he counts Martin Middlebrook, Dennis Winter, Malcolm Brown, Lynn MacDonald. Now these are the stock in trade of British kind of trade books on the war. And he's pointed out that the fact that these are all sons and daughters who at some level I think are working with parents' experiences, but who capture the market from the 1960s about the First World War. But the psychological processes of witnessing among the new generation and the emotional dynamics that lead the children to respond by composing a story of horror remain unexamined. The longer emotional history is severed by a crude distinction between myth and reality, and the insistence that memory is always the product of a later era. Ironically, this conception of the emotional legacy as a post-hoc creation suffers from the same simplifying tendencies that the military historians complain about in the literary scholarship. The memory term has contributed greatly to our understanding of the complex processes through which experiences of war were translated into memory. But as I hope you can see, I'm calling for a account of emotional legacies which doesn't, by identifying them as myth, dismiss them. In creating accounts of the First World War, the historian responds to various influences, and this is a rather crude set of points I want to make, and feel free to comment on what's missing, because there are certain things missing. But I guess I just want to illustrate three, I think, kind of psychological frames that we work within. Firstly, there's obviously the present social and cultural and political context, and within that, I would include what absorbs until now many cultural historians, which are the characteristic historiographical influences or story forms about the war within which we operate. And I suppose I would feel that the last decade has been a moment in which, you know, historians have often been absorbed by the extremes of representation and experience, and particularly for this conference. I think that's an issue. But also, secondly, there's the individual past of the historian, which of course is linked to these, which may or may not involve personal contact with a veteran, or some approximate experience of war, violence or upheaval, that is also in the frame, either as something that we reflect on, but also could be there, it could have an unconscious impact too, I think. Even members of the enough already tendency sometimes confess a personal link to the war, as if this in itself gives authority to debunk the horror narrative. But I think linked to this individual past is the question of generation, the mindsets of particular generations, and the attenuation of direct experience as the war generation and their children pass from the scene. The third generation, as Jay Winter has remarked, is the last to have a personal connection to the participants. And of course, if you think about people like Pat Barker, that position in the third generation, I think she says is part of her inspiration for the work that she did in the trilogy. And that's also a link that's true for many war historians of my generation, including many. Thirdly, the historians influenced by the emotions of the survivors, transmitted through art, poetry, letters, memoirs, oral histories, or stories told to children and grandchildren. It's not only the changing social scripts of war that have governed the horror narrative, but the ageing of survivors, particularly their feelings in later life as the repressions of memory begin to give way and they're preoccupied by death once again. And I think the life cycle of reminiscence, we haven't talked enough about it. Although there are sources aplenty for that kind of study. I mean, you know, in the Imperial War Museum, you'll often get 3 or 4 different sets of testimony from the same person. You could do an awful lot more to think about, you know, how processes of the life cycle of remembrance and that kind of work. Even silence about the war can exert an emotional influence, as I found in interviews with children who seem impelled to speak on their parents' behalf, but who are often uncertain of themselves in the interview because they know very little about the father's war. Let me illustrate how these factors influence the emotional tenor of scholarship on the war. And I'll now move to a text that, you know, many of you will know. It's Paul Fussell's The Great War and Modern Memory, published in 1975, almost 40 years ago. The book's well known for its argument that the war was a cultural watershed, sweeping away Victorian conventions which proved inadequate to describe the brutal realities of modern warfare. For Fussell, the First World War possessed particular importance as the first global conflict, but its lessons were not unique. As many commentators have pointed out, Fussell's own war hovers over the book from the opening page and its dedication to Technical Sergeant Edward Keith Hudson, quote, killed beside me in France, March 15, 1945. And the authority of the eyewitness is implicit in Fussell's bold assertion that this is how war is. This is a book about how 20th century war is. Yet if the book was partly autobiographical, it was also clearly a product of its time, not just of the anti-Vietnam War and peace movements, but of the youth movements too. And I think there's a very strong sort of Oedipal critique going on in the Great War Memory about the old against the young, the old men sending the young to their death. For me, the book's great contribution lies in its insights about the psychic geography of trench warfare and the attention Fussell gives to the struggles of victims to symbolise trauma. Fussell may have was slipshod in the finer details, and he may at some level have been using history to work through a personal trauma, but these are historical insights nonetheless, and it's these, I'd argue, rather than an audience overfed on a narrative of war as tragedy, which explains the book's enduring appeal. I first read The Great War and Modern Memory in 1979, and I have to say it was the first history book which completely absorbed me. In large part, that was because, although it was a study of literature, it made sense of how the war had affected my grandfather. The outbursts of unreasonable temper which could descend from a blue sky, his tones of savage irony when describing the deaths of men at Gallipoli and in Egypt, his habit of splitting the world into communists and capitalists, workers and bosses, white Australians and migrants, These were all Fussel's manifestations of Fussel's binary oppositions, and it was as if Fussell had written a book about my own grandfather. So if Hugh Strawn wants to understand why the public debates about commemoration appear intractable, I think he could read Fussell, who identifies absolutist thinking and binary oppositions as one of the cultural legacies of the Great War. I began with David Cameron's speech announcing the commemorations, which tried to juxtapose the binary narratives of pain and pride, but ended up alienating both tendencies. Everyone criticised it. The subsequent run-up to the centenary has been characterised by similarly rigid, fixed thinking, which I have linked to the psychological fallout from the war. That legacy still proves troublesome and leads to characteristically fixed emotional responses that actually then occlude the more complex sort of emotional responses which we might want to investigate. On the one hand, the Boo-Hoo Brigade tries to keep faith with the horror and tragedy associated with the war, but horror has to be continually re-energised so as to avoid public indifference, a task that becomes ever more difficult as the direct connections to the victims and their suffering diminish, and repeated exposure to traumatic images of the war dilutes their impact, kind of desensitisers subsequent audiences. On the other hand, the enough already tendency complains about the public's loyalty to the tragedy narrative, but still remains in its thrall through its very complaints. In trying to identify the psychological influences at work here, I found Dominic Lecapra's work on trauma helpful. Reflecting on studies of the Holocaust, he describes how the emotional potency of the material can overwhelm the historian's capacity for sense-making. One response is to seek distance by concentrating on concrete facts and manageable hard data, activities which allow the gaze to be diverted from the scene of horror. But the cost of this approach is a tendency towards objectification and a loss of empathy towards the victims. Another response is to become over-invested in horror, so that the historical interpretation amounts to little more than a post-traumatic repetition of the original scene. The historian might be impelled by voyeuristic fascination, and thinking might become similarly paralysed. I hope you can see the links I'm suggesting between the historical psychological defences that Lecapra describes and the emotional registers of commemoration. And I'll finish this part of the paper with a question. You're historians of disability and war, and I would say that you have particularly arduous psychological work to perform. The disabled First World War veteran has become a symbol par excellence of the human cost of that conflict. In terms of public memory and over-determined interpretations, the pressures could be scarcely greater. And I'll just pick one example, but I'm sure you're familiar with, there'll be many others. Some of you will know that comes from the HBO series, God, I can never remember the name, and I'll have to... Boardwalk Empire, of course it is. And whoever, the historical consultants for that program absolutely did their homework.
Yeah.
Because that character evokes all sorts of complex things about the legacy. The mask hides the pain, and he's a very vulnerable character, but he's also a consummate killer. So, if we fail to join together the narrative of killing and suffering, absolutely that program hits it. So, the program puts many of us to shame. I feel, look, and I think I can never achieve that.
Yeah.
That level of artistry that actually does the work that we need to do. But at the same time, these sorts of images fix the scene for us too. They're arresting and perceptive visions, and they're very powerful, but they also create an interpretive landscape for us, and they affect our ability to think around the frame. In terms of personal investments, the stakes are equally high. I imagine that your research is capable of stirring powerful emotions, and I remember Sabina yesterday talking about, the brain injured soldiers having to carry these buckets, and you sort of stopped, and we couldn't quite get what you were talking about. What we got was what you said, because I think you stopped because your sense making failed you, because you said it goes to the heart. And I think that was an example for me of where the thinking is temporarily overcome by the fact that it goes to the heart. So I think these are real dilemmas. We sort of knew what you were talking about, but your description was just slightly not finished. So I think that you could think about these moments where we're caught up, we're caught short. they affect all of us. Okay, so I think that the over-objectification Le Capra talks about could easily become a characteristic of the work that you do. And I would pick here on a tendency which I think we're unfreeing ourselves from, but which I did think characterised some of the early work, which is an over-focus on the discursive landscape of constructions of disability, a focus, if you like, on the externalities of identity, and a sort of timidity about tackling subjectivity. And I wonder, and there was a methodological sense and purity to that position, but it was also one that perhaps was retreating from something that felt too difficult. But I see here an unfreezing from that moment, which I think is very interesting, and moving on. But then I think the other thing would be that I've picked up here is a difficulty about the ethics of representation, which many of us have mentioned. What images should we show? What images should we not show? The question of when does it become voyeuristic to show some images, and when is it not voyeuristic? Now, these are ethical questions. They're also psychological stroke emotional ones that you can't divide the ethics of. So I think they're all areas where our position is very fraught and very difficult. And I also wonder for all of you, what the connection is between your interest in your professional interest and how you would explain it reflexively and autobiographically. There's a hidden story there for all of us, I'm sure. Okay, so then now I want to move on to talk about my interviews with the children of returned soldiers, and in particular I talk about some of my interviews with the children of disabled soldiers. The generational perspective broadens the chronology, and you see not one, but two and sometimes three wars that have touched families in Britain across the 20th century. And it's difficult to disentangle damage of one war from another, which is sometimes repeated across the generations. Harriet Pollock's father died from TB at the age of 43. In 1948, Harriet married a man who'd been invalided out of the army due to a medical condition which led to his death from throat cancer at the age of 57. So like her mother, Harriet had spent much of her life nursing a man with war wounds, and both were widowed for much of their lives. This created a close maternal tie across the generations, as I think you can see in this image. This is Harriet with two of her daughters. But the shadow of war could be broad as well as long. Shortly after Marion Armstrong and her husband began courting, they discovered that they each had fathers who were blinded in the First World War. So they met, they knew nothing about each other, lo and behold, both the fathers were blind. Secondly, family histories reveal the category of war disability as even more complex and problematic than historians have already shown it to be. In Shattered Anzac, Marina Larson shows how the health of disabled soldiers deteriorated as they grew older, and my interviews confirm this. In some cases, medical conditions were revealed as war-related quite a long time after the conflict. Kathleen Skin's father was in old age before the cause of his amnesia was revealed as shrapnel on the brain. In other cases, war wounds exacerbated later medical conditions, like the rheumatic fever which contributed to the fatal heart attack suffered by Elizabeth Gaines's father when she was in her late teens, or the gassing which weakened Harriet Pollock's father's lungs and led to his death from TB. Not surprisingly, the impact of the war is felt quite deeply among those whose fathers was disabled. But even among these children, the impact can vary quite a lot. Though he'd had his leg amputated above the knee, and we're talking about the hierarchy of suffering. I think it's fascinating children carry that hierarchy, so they always tell me when it's about disablement, it's above the knee. Because they know the hierarchy is that above the knee is different from below the knee. So they carry that hierarchy too. But anyway, David Smith's father had enjoyed a successful career as a civil servant. His family enjoyed the increased living standards afforded to those in the southeast between the wars, his father taking out a mortgage on a semi-detached house in North London. His mother was able to stay at home and be a full-time wife, but at the other extreme, people recalled the crises brought about by the sickness and deaths of disabled veterans. In families of the more severely disabled, life was dominated by the care of the father. Children had to learn to help from an early age, Some mothers were forced to find paid employment as well as care for children and the disabled veteran. The dependence on mothers to hold things together created anxieties for the children. Marion Armstrong's father had died when she was 9 from a shrapnel wound behind his eye, which turned cancerous and gradually ate away his face. She recalled feeling anxious about her mother, on whom the family of 4 was now dependent. Every afternoon she'd pass her auntie's house on the way home from school, and she'd look to see if the curtains at her home, the aunt's home, were closed. She would think, quote, "Oh, my mum hasn't died because she hasn't drawn the curtains." The biggest fear I had at that age, she explained, was that when her father died, and I was heartbroken because he was a lovely man, was if my mother died. That was the biggest emotion, unquote. The fates of fathers determined their own in quite direct ways. Harriet Pollock's father died when she was 16. His war pension was apparently stopped after his death, and her mother had to sell the family furniture and take on sewing and cleaning jobs to support the family. Now, I hope some of you will know, and I don't yet know, that 2 of the families I interviewed recently in Middlesbrough both said that the pension had been stopped on the serviceman's death because the marriage had occurred after the disability. And I don't know if that's true. Yeah. It is, yeah. Right. But these families are really angry still now about that. So the Ministry of Pensions is emerging in many of the interviews as a real object of hatred. Okay. So that was her story. Harriet herself had left school at 14, and like many children who'd lost a father, her choice of employment was influenced by the mother's predicament. Quote, "She needed me at home for the money. I was paying a lot of money. She needed me at home." I want to give a couple of illustrations of the experience of growing up with a disabled father. In the British literature on disability, the stinginess of the Ministry of Pensions is a prominent theme, and we've heard about it again at this conference. And as I say, it's echoed among the interviewees. Marion Armstrong blamed the government for her family's difficulties, explaining that the pension had stopped on her father's death because he married after receiving the ruin. When I asked her why she responded to my advertisement, she explained, "I just thought it might do some good, because I feel very bitter that my mother didn't get a pension. And I thought if that actually did happen, somebody might do something about it." Now, I'm interested in this idea of soft protest. And I think there's interesting links between what I'm finding and what you're finding about this sort of semi-protest half turned in on itself,
yes,
and carried in quite unconscious the repression of silence, but it's carried nonetheless, and it's carried through the generations as well. Marion Armstrong wants others to know about this past injustice, and her testimony is a way of trying to ensure that the pain caused to her mother and herself doesn't slip from the historical record. She wants it on the record that actually did happen, even though she herself, as a war widow, had comparatively much more generous treatment by the War of Pensions after the Second World War, but the damage from the first and the anger is carried still then across the generations. Okay. Children like this suffer a double psychological burden, as they not only had childhoods constrained by financial hardships and the demand of care for the father, they also carry the distress of the parents. And this is what the psychoanalyst Elaine Kogan describes as, quote, primitive identification, a sharpening of the child's sense of empathy as they absorb and seek to contain the mental representation of the parent's trauma. Such a child may develop a strong and sometimes oppressive sense of responsibility, a desire to want to repair damage, or feelings of guilt at being unable to help. Interestingly, my interviews have focused as much on the mother's situation, forced to keep the family going, as on the disabled father. Kathleen Skin began our interview with a description of her father's injuries. And I won't read that. He later contracted malaria, and as a child, Kathleen records him going into feverish sweats for a fortnight at a time. All they could do was change his bedclothes and try to keep him cool. But despite the debilitating nature of his injuries, the Ministry of Pensions was constantly trying to reduce the pension. He wasn't able to work because employers would rather hire an able-bodied man and preferred to give work to an unemployed man than a man with a pension. But Skin's father had 5 children to support. And when Kathleen was around 8 or 9, he became, as she said, slightly strange. This is later discovered as a brain injury. The father was more or less confined to a mental hospital. She broke down when describing one Christmas when he was hospitalised and the family had no money. She contrasts the help given by the leader of the local brownie troop and a prominent family with the parsimony of the Ministry of Pensions. Now here again, we're getting a story that Cohen and many other people have talked about, the way that voluntary agencies have a close relationship. They step in where the state does not. And this is another example of that. So she is describing Christmas. It's the story, a knock at the door. She herself was sound asleep. At the door is a chauffeur, with a sack and boxes and a valet dressed in uniform from the local wealthy household. That was Brownell's family. She thought they had to do something. And so at a time where they had no money for Christmas, they were given these gifts. And then she goes on to say how the thing that really upset her mother, and then she herself starts to cry, is the valet, who, although not wealthy, had pressed money into the mother's hand. So father comes home on Christmas Day, all wrapped up in a blanket. We had a good Christmas. I don't know how they managed. So we went up and we went down. Now, I want you to see this because every now and then my father kept having a letter saying, come and be examined, because they tried to take away his pension, because they found out that he could dig the garden and grow vegetables. And then she thrust a letter into my hand, and that's the letter. And given the letter, I say, I'll read this out then, shall I? Poverty left a deep impression on Kathleen's skin, but it was an impression above all of her mother's predicament and feelings. And remember, this is not a story, it's not an eyewitness experience that she's relating here. This is a story about her mother answering the door when she was asleep, and her mother being given these gifts, and her mother having the money pressed into her hands, which still makes her cry even now, at the age of 91, as she talks about it. Okay, but as she's crying about her mother's distress, I become quite upset, and she seems to have taken in the mother's hurt. She's taken in the mother's anger, and as she pushes the pensions letter to me to read out, because I'm the historian who brings this into history, I feel I'm being invited to share the upset and anger, a case of transmission from the mother to the daughter to the interviewer. This is what I mean about the way the legacies carry forward in time. My second example taps into another prominent theme in the secondary literature, the emphasis of reconstruction and rehabilitation on remaking the man, and the question of how disability challenged masculine identities. Such issues, I think, though, could affect not only the veteran, but also the veteran's children. Alan Pentney's father was an amputee. Again, he told me very clearly, the leg cut off above the knee. He trained as a boot repairer after the war, but the tiny Norfolk village where they lived was too small to support a boot repair business. His father's war pension was insufficient, and as the family grew, Pentney was one of four, they got further and further into debt. Like Kathleen's account, Pentney's interview revolved around his mother. She'd saved the family by setting up a general store with money borrowed from a local family that she'd known as a child. And in fact, I think this is a family she would have married one of the sons, but didn't. The shop eventually prospered, but it was hard work for his mother. Quote, and so she set him to work. And she worked like a demon. Worked 12, 15 hours a day running the shop, looking after the family, keeping things going, and helping my father to go about his business. I was struck by the contrasting fates of his parents. When Alan was around 13, just as his mother was beginning to make a success of the store, his father suffered a series of strokes. Among other things, the strokes affected his speech and ability to eat. Quote, he'd invariably dribble and drop stuff out of his mouth, which was unpleasant. But then, that's how he did it, and, you know, we didn't take notice of that was Dad, that was just how he lived. And so we just used to accept that in the family. Here I think you're getting the teenagers' disgust. But then it's saying to you, look, it's just how it wasn't anything. It's very complex, the feelings that this sort of description arises. It feels disloyal to say that about the father too, and I think that comes across in these sorts of passages. Pentney was at pains to convey his mother's remarkable ability to manage. They never went hungry because she trained as a cook and was good at improvising with food that came from the gardens of neighbours because they lived in the countryside. She was resourceful in clothing them, and he recalled the brown suit that she had spotted in a second-hand shop, a cast-off school uniform, which he used to wear for Sunday best. Fitted me perfectly. I was so proud of that suit, he said. He was full of praise for his mother's enterprise. My mother could do anything. She was hard-working, never stopped work. She liked work, enjoyed work. And as I say, she looked after us and she kept us all going. Now, his mother's successes included his father. Her income allowed him to keep his business going in a small workshop off to the side of the store. And her income covered his expenses, the half pint that he enjoyed every night in the local pub, and the pony and trap that he rode around in. And later, she made such a success that she was able to buy a car for him, in which he would go and get the morning papers and bring them back. That was his only job for the store. And then he'd go to his boot repair business. When I asked if his father had ever helped out in the shop, she said, he might come into the shop when Mother was out, and perhaps just sort of stand by on the counter, make sure of everything. But he didn't sell any stuff. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what the value of stuff was. And he virtually couldn't sell the stuff. But he'd just stand there and guard the shop. But that's all. Mainly he talked to the people who came in. And he describes his father as very sociable on a number of occasions. Even simple domestic tasks proved difficult for his father. He'd volunteer to do the washing up, but someone had to go and fetch the bowl from the scullery, bring it to the kitchen, put it on the table, get the water and put the water in for him. He couldn't manage those things. But he'd do all he could, and then he would do the washing up. And someone else had to put it away. So everyone helped him, but he would do what he could, when he could. That's another complicated passage where he's, on the one hand, telling me, look, he couldn't really do anything. But on the other hand, he's also saying, but he did what he could. And they're contradictory things, I think, in the way he expresses them here at some level. He acknowledged his father's efforts to help, but his dominant memory was of the help his father needed. The gender roles here were partly reversed. The breadwinning abilities of Pentney's mother had secured the reasonable life, not just for the disabled soldier, but for the entire family. In other ways, however, the role taken by his mother was traditionally feminine. She was his father's saviour, Pentney explained. Quote, she was the making of him, and she kept him going all his life, unquote. Righto. Support him though she did, the marriage was based on pity rather than love. According to Pentney, his parents had only known each other for a matter of weeks before he left for the war, and on his return, she had felt an obligation to marry him. Pentney was clear that, had it not been for his father's disability, she would never have known him. And I'll put together 3 different parts of the interview where he returns to that statement about the fact that his parents were not suited and his mother would never have married his father had it not been for his disability. They were never suitable. And she even told him who she would have married instead. That's quite interesting. You would tell a son that. I had the impression of Pentney's father as a semi-detached figure, heading off in his pony and trap to the pub, or in his workshop beside the store. His father's difficulties, coupled with Pentney's admiration for his mother's energy and recognition that the children depended on her for their survival, conspired in a close bond between mother and son. His older brother was his father's favourite, Pentney explained. He went on to say, quote, I was my mother's favourite, so I made up for it. What do you mean? I asked. And he replied, well, my best times in my early life was crawling on my mother's lap in the evening, having 5 minutes cuddle, you know, when I was, 3, 4, 5, 6? Best time in my life. The two remained close during his adolescence, after his brother enlisted in the Second World War. His mother's relationship with his father, therefore, was based on care and duty, but Pentney was the apple of his mother's eye. His father's disability conspired in skewing the Oedipal triangle. Financially dependent, physically repugnant, struggling with the simplest of tasks, his father was hardly a man that Alan Pentney could look up to. Against the father he'd known, however, Pentney held up an idealised vision of an undamaged father. At the age of 13, he explained at the start of our interview, his father had been made head team man on a local farm in charge of a team of horses. Quote, now that's extraordinary, because boys weren't allowed to have teams of horses, not until they got to be mature. So in the story he tells, his father was an exceptional character who could man enough to hold a whole team of horses, even as an adolescent. And that was proof that his father had not been ineffectual by nature, but that the war had made him this way. Now, my second case study was on psychoanalysis and the child. However, I've got 10 minutes, right? Okay. What I'll do is perhaps just give you a slight indication of where I'm going with that. And again, it's an illustration of what I'm talking about as the Long War. In the history of psychoanalysis, the Second War, not the first, is normally seen as the key moment in the exposure of childhood to psychoanalytic gaze. The disruption and separation that civilian bombing caused, the argument goes, created a new emphasis on the fragile psychic world of the child and its relations with its parents. Many of you will know about Anna Freud's studies from the Hampstead Nursery of children who were removed from the family home because of bombing. There were similar studies of children going on in Cambridge by the Kleinian Susan Isaacs, and in a recent book by Michelle Shapira called The War Inside, she writes about the way that the war brings in this focus of psychoanalysis on the child. Okay, so I suppose I just want to go back and say, oh, hang on a minute. Oh, it's the First War too. Don't forget the First War. Because I think there's another story to be told about the development of child analysis between the wars, which has to do with the aftermath of the First World War. After the First World War, you get a very quick change from work on war neuroses to work on children. And in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, you can chart that in terms of the numbers of publications. There are none on war neuroses by the late 20s, but by the early mid-20s, you're getting up to 20 publications in each issue to do with the analysis of children. Freud commented in 1925 that, quote, children have become the main subject of psychoanalytic research and have thus replaced in importance the neurotics on whom the studies began. So my child analysis is your bird. It's the outlandish figure where the war is present, but actually people perhaps don't see it, There's a biographical aspect to these shifts in psychoanalytic concerns, and I haven't got the time to talk about much about it. But even if you looked at Freud, his son Oliver's serving in the army as an army engineer. Martin is a gunner in the Austrian army. He's away for almost 5 years. He's made a prisoner of war. Ernst caught TB in the trenches, had to be sent to a sanatorium. And in 1919, Freud's beloved daughter Sophie died from influenza. There's Freud with Sophie. Anna Freud spent much time in the Halberstadt household looking after Sophie's 2 children, recently bereaved, the elder one of whom died a few years later from what was called military TB. And at this time, Anna Freud was training as a child analyst and being analysed by her own father. And her analysis starts in 1918. And in 1923, she begins to treat children. In 1924, she sets up a course at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Training Institute on child analysis. Family separations and bereavements formed part of the personal context during which Freud adjusts his clinical thinking and at the time in which Anna is in analysis with him and turning her attention to analysis, having been a teacher earlier in her career. Freud's earlier work concludes his biographer Peter Gay, quote, had not had enough death in them, or more precisely, they'd not integrated what they had to say about death into his theory. Beyond the pleasure principle, Freud's essay of 1919, which sets out a new theory of an innate death drive, was partly derived from observing a wartime separation. In the essay, Freud passes straight from a discussion of war neurosis victims to observing his 18-month-old son in his play. The link he makes between the adult and child is one which evokes larger historical shifts. Freud asks why the victims of war neuroses should want to repeat in their nightmares the horrific events that are thought to have caused their condition. The pleasure principle, he suggests, does not govern on its own. There's an equal primitive force, which is the death instinct, which seeks to undo life and is absorbed in unpleasure. The game played by Freud's grandson, who would die of military TB, Ernst Halberstadt, involved a wooden reel bound with string, which Ernst would throw away so it was concealed and then pull back with the exclamation, "Duh." The game, Freud interpreted, was directed towards dealing with the trauma of separation from his mother, for he never showed any emotions when he was away. The game was a means of managing separation through play, giving a sense of control over the trauma within the objects of his reach, but Freud thought it might have an even more destructive aspect, the throwing away of the reel suggesting, all right then, go away, I don't need you, I'm sending you away myself. To further adduce evidence for the death instinct, and its destructive instinct, Freud described Ernst's angry behaviour a year later when he'd hurl his toys to the floor and say, "Go to the front." The phrase, concludes Freud, expressed the hostility attached to the boy's Oedipal victory over his absent father. The working of the death instinct is linked in Freud's mind to the war, the impulse to destroy, the traumas of separation, and the damaged psyche's tendency to repeat painful experiences. So, it's within the mind of the child that these primitive destructive impulses are revealed and illuminated. As Peter Gay observes, Freud's reformulation of psychoanalysis in 1919 to admit the idea of a death instinct may have owed something to the losses in his family, although Freud insisted that he'd begun to draft beyond the pleasure principle before Sophie's death. It's not just the private trauma of Sophie's death, however, but the entire context of war, absence of loss, symbolised in the boy's "go to the front" then, as he throws the reel away, or throws objects away. It's the war, in a broader sense, is animating the imaginative leap that Freud makes from the shell-shocked soldier through to the child, through to his startling conclusion that, quote, "the aim of all life is death," unquote. Now, I won't go on to Melanie Klein, but I could, because I think she's equally invested in the war. Again, her first analysis with children is with her own children. And her husband was away at the war for a year in 1915, and he comes back with a leg wound. And I wonder how much the repression of pain in that family is part of the story there, in the way she observes the Oedipal dynamics with her own two children. But of course, in the psychoanalytic take, and particularly for Kleinians, the internal world is all. And the war is only ever another source of fantasy, but never itself an object of the analytic gaze. So this is another example of where the war may be animating intellectual developments, but is hasn't really itself been brought enough into the story. Okay, will I stop there? Oh, well, just one little coda, one final thing. I opened last Saturday's Guardian. Lo and behold, what did I find? The first 4 pages of war poetry. Andrew Motion, Carol Ann Duffy, Jackie Kay, Simon Armitage, the last poem to be composed by Seamus Heaney before his death. Carol Duffy had invited them all to respond in poetry to poems, letters, diaries, and other first-hand testimony from the war. I must confess, I opened the Guardian with a sinking heart. There they go again. They've captured the gaze. And below them, because they're now working with our sources, they're now working with letters and memoirs and historical documents, and they're writing on the back of that to create this fantastic poetry. And they're continuing then to claim the emotional legacy as their ground. So I've tried to suggest in my 2 case studies the value of constructing a longer history of the war's psychological impact. By talking to the children, we can investigate the influence of a war that was rarely discussed within families, but whose effects were felt nonetheless. And cultural histories can reveal the war's impact in intellectual, sport, or other developments whose origins in the aftermath are unseen or casually asserted but not investigated. In all these ways, we can reveal an emotional history of the war that's just as complex, moving and connected to the emotions of the victims as the poet's orchestration of voices. And that's the challenge that the centenary poses to us. Yeah.